This grain built the first civilization, then destroyed it. It covered 90% of cultivated land in ancient Mesopotamia, and workers received 60 liters of it per month, which they could use to trade, or more commonly, turn into bread. It's not einkorn, it's not emmer, it's not common wheat. My name is Arim, and I'm the author of Table of Gods, a cookbook inspired by the world's oldest recipes written on clay tablets in ancient Mesopotamia. 6,000 years ago, in what's modern-day Iraq, the world's first city emerged, Uruk. By this time, grains had already been domesticated by humans for thousands of years, or to paraphrase Yuval Noah Harari, grains had domesticated humans for thousands of years. As Harari writes in his book Sapiens, the domestication of grains was a revolution that transformed humanity forever, and once it spread, it became irreversible. But within the agricultural revolution, another revolution took place 6,000 years ago in southern Mesopotamia. This revolution gave our ancestors a huge surplus of this grain. According to Professor Mario Liverani, the revolution was brought about mainly by 5 inventions. 1. Cultivation in long fields covering up to 30 hectares, the equivalent of 42 soccer fields. 2. Canal-based irrigation made possible by diverting water from Tigris and Euphrates, and controlling how much entered the furrows. 3. Animal-powered seeder plows that worked the ground and planted seeds more efficiently. 4. The threshing sledge, pulled by donkeys. And 5. Cheap mass-produced clay sickles, a crescent-shaped tool with sharp inner edges. In his book, Uruk, the First City, Liverani writes, "On the whole, I suggest, not without a certain hesitation, that the passage from a traditional system of family farming, breaking the ground with a hoe, casting seeds, irrigating by inundation, to the technical and organizational structure that I have described here, would have brought about an increased productivity in the order of between 500 to 1,000%, the number of people employed being equal. We can very well call this a revolution in agricultural technology taking place in Lower Mesopotamia some centuries before the urban revolution and the formation of early states. It is a historical event of enormous significance, and it is documented archaeologically in several ways. The people behind the revolution Liverani writes about, who increased agricultural productivity tenfold, who invented writing, schools, governments, laws, and taxes for better or worse, were the Sumerians. Historians are still debating how the Sumerians ended up in ancient Mesopotamia, and one way to get 1 million views on YouTube is to state that Sumerians came from another planet in another solar system, mined gold on Earth, and returned to whatever planet and solar system they came from. I wouldn't mind 1 million views, but this video is about historical facts and the grain that sustained 85,000 people in the world's first city. In 3500 BC, the agricultural productivity Liverani wrote about turned a village known as Uruk into the world's first city. If you want to know exactly how a city is defined, I suggest you read this book, Uruk, the First City of the Ancient World. By 3500 BC, the surplus of this grain led people in Uruk to specialize in 125 different professions. During this period, the first government formed. And this is the time when civilization as we know it actually began. It's why ancient Mesopotamia is often called the cradle of civilization. People worked hard, paid their taxes, traded, and so on. And this is what Harari means by grains domesticating us, and not the other way around. Harari argues that the hunter-gatherer way of life was much more pleasant and natural for us to live, compared to the hard-working life of this new civilized society, which we still live in, by the way. And civilized life in Uruk posed many challenges. Who would track how much grain there was in the granaries, how much grain a certain person owed the temple, or how much grain the temple needed to pay the workers? No matter how smart we believe ourselves to be, our brains can't store lots of information, especially not numbers. And perhaps that's why writing was invented right here, in Uruk, around 3500 BC. But early writing could not be used to write literature or recipes. It was mainly used for boring things like accounting. My best friend is an accountant, so don't take it personally if you are too. Here's a 5,000-year-old clay tablet from Uruk with the earliest writing in history. As you can see, it's a pictographic script. This writing system included about 1,500 signs with fewer than 500 in frequent use. But the signs didn't represent sounds, with a few exceptions. They were mostly self-explanatory drawings of objects. For instance, fish, head and bowl were simply drawings resembling a fish, a head and a bowl. But some signs could be combined to create a third sign, like the head next to a bowl, meaning ration. And this is actually a tablet recording a ration, or a salary slip if you will, in beer. Yes, workers in Uruk were among many things also paid in beer, which was brewed using this grain I've been avoiding to disclose in order to keep your attention for as long as I possibly can. And while I have your attention, I wanted to let you know about my upcoming cookbook, Table of Gods. If you want to learn more, visit tableofgods.com/YT and join 108,000 people on the waitlist to get 3 recipes from the book. Through Table of Gods, you'll be able to host unforgettable dinners, tell stories of kings and gods, walk the streets of the first cities, learn to speak Akkadian and Sumerian, write anything you want in cuneiform, and much more. The book is essentially a time machine that will bring you and whoever you choose to take with you back to ancient Mesopotamia. Pre-orders for the book open in August 2026, and people on the waitlist will be prioritized once the books are produced and ready to ship. It costs nothing to join the waitlist, and I only send emails on my progress, usually once per month. So, by 3000 BC, this grain had caused the population size in Uruk to explode. According to Professor Guillermo Algaze, at a minimum, by the final phase of the Uruk period, that is 3100 BC, the growing regional polities centered at Uruk had a population that can be conservatively estimated at well upwards of 80 to 90,000 people. And this estimate necessarily excludes the many small sites that were surely missed by the surveyors, as well as associated but inherently different to trace transhuman and marsh-dwelling populations. If we assume a population of 85,000 people and divide it by the 12 million world population at the time, that's 0.7% of the world population living in Uruk in 3100 BC. If we were to include the largest city, the population could have been twice as large. This is still during a time when, by definition, everyone who didn't live in Uruk didn't live in a city. Most people lived in villages, but there was still a large population living in caves and huts. I mean, this is a time when mammoths still roam parts of the earth. But even the greatest inventions have drawbacks. And for the Sumerians to increase agricultural productivity by 10 times, they had to divert water from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to the cultivation fields. Southern Mesopotamia was and still is a dry place with little rainfall. They had no choice but to irrigate their fields. But the downside is that salt builds up in the soil, and the only grain that could tolerate the salty soils was this one, which the Sumerians relied on to feed hundreds of thousands of people. And as the surplus of this grain kept increasing, more Sumerian city-states emerged in southern Mesopotamia. Ur, Lagash, and Nippur were some of the largest. And in the 3rd millennium BC, we enter a period historians call the Early Dynastic. This is when we get history's first kings, or Lugal, as they were called in Sumerian, meaning big man. Since this grain could be kept for years, it became a kind of currency, a very early type of money, if you will. Money that you could also eat, which makes it much more practical than our money. But in any case, with this early form of money came power, and with power came the human lust for more power. But to gain more power, one often has to take it from someone else. The farmers who used to rest in between cultivation and harvest of this grain were now called to arms. The first organized wars in Mesopotamia broke out between Lagash and Umma, and were depicted in the stele of vultures, which is now housed at the Louvre Museum in Paris. Lagash was victorious this time, but Umma would have the last word. The ongoing wars between Lagash and Umma weren't even about conquering land. They were about water rights conflicts, if that reminds you of anything in 2026. To further strengthen their power and rule, Sumerian kings enacted the first laws in history. And to prevent attacks on their growing granaries that were like the Sumerian equivalent of our central banks, kings started building walls around their cities. This beautiful image of the Sumerians who built our first cities and came up with all these wonderful inventions suddenly looks much more hostile. But it would get worse. In the 24th century BC, a man named Sharukin, more commonly known as Sargon, built an army of 5,000 professional soldiers. That was all it took to conquer all Sumerian city-states in the south, as well as all the northern parts of Mesopotamia. Sargon united all his conquered territories under one Akkadian Empire, history's first empire. And without simplifying history, I'd argue this grain played a major role in all this. Because without it, we might not have had cities in the first place, and without cities, we wouldn't have early governments, which led to kings, which led to wars, and so on. King Sargon appointed his daughter Enheduanna as a high priestess in the city of Ur, where she was responsible for the granaries. But Enheduanna was also a scribe, and by attaching her name to a hymn she wrote in the 23rd century BC, she became history's first recorded author. The pictographic script from Uruk had long since evolved into a syllabic script, which is why we have the first hymns, recipes, and stories from ancient Mesopotamia. Enheduanna's role as a high priestess also included offering food to the gods, not least the moon god Sin. People in ancient Mesopotamia believed their gods had the same needs as humans. Thus, they had to be fed every day. Cooking for the gods is also one of the reasons the first cuisine developed in ancient Mesopotamia. I mean, how much better would your food taste if you cooked for the gods? And I know you wonder about the gods' leftovers. Although the Mesopotamian gods had huge appetites, which we know from administrative clay tablets noting that some gods were offered as much as 400 loaves of bread and 130 liters of beer daily, they probably didn't drink or eat it all. Their leftovers went to the royals and the priesthood, in that order. King Sargon's empire didn't last long, and the Sumerians rose again. This time, they reached heights never seen before. Historians call this period following King Urnamu's reign in the 21st century BC a Sumerian Renaissance. Sumerian culture was flourishing, granaries were larger than ever, and the export of wool garments from millions of sheep turned the Sumerian city-states wealthy beyond imagination. Great ziggurats were built, cities expanded, and the infrastructure improved. Urnamu's son, King Shulgi, renovated the road between Ur and Nippur and built garden-fringed rest houses every 7 miles or 11 kilometers for weary travelers to rest and eat before continuing in either direction. During the 21st century BC, the economy in southern Mesopotamia was not grain-based anymore, but silver-based. 1 shekel of silver, which was about 8.33 grams, was valued at 300 liters of this grain. But just because this grain wasn't used as primary currency anymore, doesn't mean it wasn't important. In fact, it was more important than ever. Although the Sumerian states were bigger, wealthier, and more populated than they had ever been, they were also more vulnerable. By the end of the 21st century BC, the harvest of this grain failed. With a large population and not enough grain reserves, inflation soared. Professor Nicholas Postgate writes in Early Mesopotamia, Society and Economy at the Dawn of History. The severe inflation in the city of Ur at the end of Ibisin's reign, that is, by the end of the 21st century BC, when grain urgently had to be shipped downstream from Isin, may surely be put down to political causes. But we cannot be sure that this was not part of a general failure in the southern cities to match their cereal production to their population. For some time, Ur had received grain deliveries downstream on boats from Isin, probably because of failed grain harvests. But when the Amorite warlord Ishbi-Erra conquered Isin, the deliveries stopped. The price of fish increased 24 times, oil prices increased 5-fold, but the price for this grain, the most important staple of all, increased 60-fold. King Ibisin was furious. He wrote a letter where he called Ishbi-Erra an ape and a wandering idiot with the understanding of a dog. That might actually be history's first recorded insult. In 2004 BC, as a result of famine and inflation, combined with pressure from the Amorites in the north and a surprise attack from the Elamites in the east, Ur fell. The Sumerian Renaissance was over, and the people who built our first civilization vanished from the face of the earth. Or did they? When I ate this bread, made from the grain that built our first civilization, am I not bringing Sumerian culture into the present? I think I am. This is one of the recipes from my book, and I chose to call it bapir, because that's what it was called. All we know about bapir is that it was a bread made from this grain. How it was made and what it looked like is up to interpretation. There is, however, a hymn to the goddess Ninkasi that reveals bapir was actually used in the beer brewing process. A line from the hymn reads, Ninkasi, it is you who bake the bapir in the big oven, you who soak the malt in the jar. The waves rise, the waves fall. The big oven referred to in this hymn was big. In the city of Lagash, archaeologists uncovered an oven with a diameter of 16.4 feet or 5 meters. That's larger than my entire kitchen, and even larger than some studio apartments they build nowadays. Anyway, we don't have an oven that large, so we're using a modern one. We're also going to cheat with instant yeast because we don't have a good sourdough starter. The Sumerians would probably have added yogurt, beer, or just a sourdough from the last batch to get the dough rising. But here's the thing. No matter how much yeast you use, this dough doesn't have enough gluten to rise or become fluffy like a wheat loaf. But nevertheless, it was bread. And eating bread was a fundamental part of being human in ancient Mesopotamia. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the things the wild man Enkidu had to do before becoming civilized was to eat bread. And whenever bread was eaten in a Sumerian context, 9 times out of 10 it would have been made from the flour of this grain. Okay, it's time to reveal what type of grain it is, but first I need to try this bread. But I'm going to add some butter, date syrup, and more salt. Okay, let's try this bread. It's really dense. It actually reminds me of lembas in The Lord of the Rings. Not that I have had lembas, but it just made me think about it. I don't know that I could eat it without the butter and date syrup, but I mean, what kind of bread can you eat without butter? Although I've just taken a small bite, this is filling. Again, makes me think about lembas. But it's just amazing to eat this and think back at the millions of Sumerians who over thousands of years ate this bread. And I think it's time I reveal the grain used to make it. So if you haven't guessed it already, this is barley.